Hello students, welcome back. In the previous lecture, we spoke at length about content analysis and particularly we spoke about media content analysis. And before we went on to discuss how to do a content analysis, of course, we spoke at length that why media analysis, why media content analysis is very, very pertinent, right? Remember, media being a facilitator and media being a representation of the society. Of course, today it's as well, we are going to talk about content analysis. We are going to talk about media content analysis, but I'm going to take you through a particular kind of qualitative analysis which is slightly different from media content analysis, that is thematic analysis. But before we go on to thematic analysis, let me give you a quick recap as to what exactly was content analysis, in the sense how to pursue a content analysis. Now, when it came to content analysis, which could be a combination of quantitative and qualitative, if you remember, you were supposed to initially select the text, that is text which is relevant to your research question. Now, we discussed that what could be the possible text options. These text options could be your interview transcriptions, which you of course can transcribe yourself, or you can take a software to transcribe it. It could be focus group extracts. You choose focus group as a method, or it could be possibly the blogs and the content you find on internet, or a print media content, and so on and so forth. So it can be any kind of text which you choose as your initial text, on the basis of which you will try to answer your research question. Once you have your text at hand, then you organize your text, of course, again with the help of a software, or you do it manually in Word and Excel and so on and so forth, and you define your units and categories of analysis. This is what we referred as coding, if you remember in the previous lecture. And we also discussed what exactly is coding. Of course, I'm going to draw a little more on coding today, because coding is essentially a part of both content analysis and as well as thematic analysis in general. Code the text, of course, according to your research question. And finally, you draw out the report and you analyze the result and draw the conclusion. I have drawn out the differences between thematic analysis and content analysis for you. I'm also going to read out and of course explain them to you as well. Number 1, content analysis is a data analysis method. So is thematic analysis, but content analysis is essentially a data analysis method that is used to analyze data with the aid of both qualitative and quantitative data. This is actually the main difference between content analysis and thematic analysis. Whereas when we talk about thematic analysis, is a method of qualitative data analysis that can be used with varying research designs, right? So it is more wider in its context as well, and particularly it deals with the qualitative data. Analyzes both qualitative and quantitative data, whereas that is content analysis, whereas thematic analysis only is about your qualitative data. So it is not about quantitative data. Once again, content analysis, content data analyzed through content analysis can help to identify frequencies of data. So how many times, remember the example which I was giving you? So we were talking about films and I told you that how many times the question of women development comes in films referring to a particular time period. So then you're particularly, and you're only talking about frequency, right, which is numbers. So that is particularly content analysis. But when in thematic analysis, you cannot deal with content. You cannot deal with frequencies alone. Of course, frequencies is important. Numbers are important, which is quantitative research analysis particularly. But here, rather, you draw out inferences. You draw out themes from the more qualitative data, such as interviews, such as focus group extracts. So more qualitative inferences of the data which is there in front of you. Lastly, researchers focus in on identifying themes and developing the analysis in the most cohesive manner possible. Here also in thematic analysis, researchers focus more on frequency of occurrence of various categories. This might sound a little confusing because here again, in spite of being a thematic analysis, analysis, it's talking about frequency. But this frequency is not just numbers. It's repetition of an idea which comes across in the text, right? And based on the repetition of the ideas and based on the repetition of the thoughts, you derive inferences. So once I discuss coding a little more at length today, this will be clear to you. However, as I already said, there's a lot of overlaps between content analysis, because a major part of content analysis is also just qualitative inferences with the aid of coding, which is essentially what thematic analysis is. So there are overlaps, right? So don't get confused between both of these methods. Let me introduce you what is thematic analysis, and then I want you to take a minute and think about the difference. Thematic analysis is a process of identifying pattern or themes within qualitative data. Okay? The goal of the thematic analysis is to identify themes, that is, patterns in the data that are important or interesting. And here is the difference. I mentioned the word pattern. Pattern is not a number, but pattern, the word itself, is very, very important when it comes to thematic analysis. You have to keep looking for a pattern in the kind of data you have in your hand. And this is particularly relevant to, of course, media content analysis, because again, going back to the example, films, how many films? What are the kind of films? Or suppose you're kind of trying to draw a pattern. Say you have decided that I will watch a particular 9 p.m. news of this particular channel from so-and-so week to so-and-so week. And then you try and draw an inferences. And what do you mean by this inference? This inference is you're trying to draw a pattern. Then you might say that, okay, most of the news is Delhi-centric. Or this might be a question that is most of the news metropolitan-centric, right? If this is your question, you will see repetition of Delhi. Or news which has its origin in Delhi and other metropolitan cities, and therefore, of course, you can derive a reference. It's not just purely about numbers, right? It's there. You have to also look at the content. What is the kind? So even if the content might be in some rural village, the origin might be in Delhi. So you have to derive inferences based on certain patterns and not just certain numbers. This is what thematic analysis is all about. This is much more than simply summarizing the data, right? A good thematic analysis interprets and makes sense of it. So it's not just that, you have data at hand and you have a couple of interviews which you have conducted, and then you kind of listen to these interviews and you make some sense of it and write a report. That is not, in fact, that is not research at all, right? So that is not thematic analysis. It is a method, right? You have to go through a particular rigorous process and conduct thematic analysis. Now I want you to take a minute and note down, what do you think is the difference between content analysis and thematic analysis? So let's now talk about two level of analysis, right? And when I say analysis, I'm talking about the analysis of data. And this is a part and parcel of the thematic analysis, which we were just talking about. So these two level of analysis is basically the semantic level and the latent level. Let's look at what exactly are these. Semantic level is basically the explicit or the surface meaning of the data. When you are kind of reading the data, say you are reading all your interview transcripts and so on and so forth. So you have a general understanding of what your data is trying to talk about. So this kind of surface meaning of the data, and the analysis, the person who's doing the analysis is not looking for anything beyond what the participation has said or what the participant has written. This sort of surface analysis is basically on the semantic level, that is analysis on on the semantic level. In contrast, the next level, which is the latent level, and of course you'll have to do a combination of both, looks beyond what has simply been said or what has simply been written and tries to identify or examine the underlying ideas. So it's the ideas. Remember themes, patterns, and this thematic analysis. So this is where you are kind of trying to understand the underlying ideas, underlying assumption, right, or conceptualization of whatever you have read. Ideologies, right? So what is the ideology behind your data? That is something which you infer on a latent level. So the ideologies which are theorized and particularly shapes the information that is basically comes when the reading is on the semantic content of the data. Let me give you a few examples also from the kind of work which I am doing at this point of time. So recently I was working on the role of visual effects in films, but this was particularly with reference to role of visual effects in pre-visualization, right? So in the pre-production stage of cinema. So I had no answers, of course. I mean, this was something which I was trying to find out, right? What role does in contemporary times or in at present? And of course, my research was particularly with reference to Hindi film industry, and I was trying to find out what role does VFX play in the pre-production part of the film. So for that, I was kind of trying to take, I did take about 8 to 10 interviews of people who are in the film business, in the sense particularly people who are visual effects artists as well as directors and so on and so forth, right? So once I had the interviews, I of course thought of what will be my possible method, and I thought of thematic analysis, and therefore the first thing I did was I kind of transcribed all the data, that is all the interviews and the data I had, and I kind of I was reading through the transcript. So that's one level. So first was semantic, and therefore thereafter I was trying to understand the ideologies, understand what or conceptualize, therefore what is that role of VFX exactly on the pre-production level at all, if there is role or not, right? So the quantitative thing, which is basically content analysis, was with reference to how many films did actually use VFX when it came to pre-production, which was simple, I was looking at numbers there. So that's not thematic analysis. That particularly comes in the purview of content analysis. But when it particularly I came to qualitative data, that is, I'm not just looking at how many films is using VFX in the pre-production, but I'm rather looking at what are the ways in which VFX is being used, or does it have a possible effect on the narrative of these films? These are the questions, these are the understanding, these are the larger theorization, which cannot be done simply with the aid of by saying that so and so films or so many films out of those 20 films or 10 films used VFX in the pre-production, right? So then I tried finding out or figuring out that what are the ways in which or what were the possible impact of use of VFX in the pre-production stage. This was just to give an example of how, I'm talking about a lot of method, but then of course you'll also have to know how to use these methods. And of course, something which I have not covered in my lecture is, first of all, to arrive at a good research question and thereafter use the method to apply to answer that research question. Now, let's come to doing the analysis. That is fine. I have all the data, in the sense that I have all the interviews of all these VFX artists and directors and fantastic people. But then how do I infer this, whatever understanding I want to infer, that, what is the role, or does it impact the film? How do I infer this data? Now, there are 6 steps actually, and let me take you through all of these steps. Number 1 is become familiar with the data. How do you become familiar with the data? By itself, when you're taking the interviews or when you're transcribing them, automatically you're becoming familiar with the data. Step 2 is very important. In this phase, we start to organize our data in a meaningful and a systematic way, right? coding reduces, and here we come to coding. Because coding reduces a lot of this data, right? You have taken some 20 interviews which are say 1 hour long. Can you imagine the amount of data you have in your hand, right? So, but you will have to now somehow find a way to organize this data also, right? So for that, you will have to think about, so these are my possible questions, and then therefore this is how I can infer things. So I'm going to come to how to do coding. But coding, basically the idea behind coding is to reduce this huge amount of data into small chunks of meaning, right? I also call it small chunks of understanding, right? There are different ways to code, of course, and the method will be determined by your research question. So how you code is absolutely up to you. But coding is very important because this is how you infer the data. And before I talk about coding, let me talk about a little bit what are the two kinds of coding. The two kinds of coding are deductive coding and inductive coding. Right? What is deductive coding? And I'll explain this with example. You start off with a set of codes and you stick to them. I think that, okay, fine. Now I'm going to look at all these VFX interviews and I have to find out two things. Say, for example, I'm going to look at that how these VFX use in the pre-production method is going to impact the narrative, and I'm going to also look at that whether spectacle is associated with VFX, and particularly when VFX is being used even at the pre-production stage. It's something like I have a set of things in my mind and I'm going to look for the answers in the interviews and so on and so forth. This is called the deductive coding, right? The other option is, which is also very interesting, is that you do not have any preconceived idea. So I have no idea about what is the possible result of the use of VFX in contemporary Hindi films, of course, in the pre-production stage, right? And I've just interviewed these people and I have this large amount of data. And now I'm going to read through all the data and infer that what could be the possible ways in which I do my inferences, right? So whether is it only about the narrative, or is it about the budget, or is it about some sort of international collaborations? What is it exactly I'm trying to find when I talk about VFX? In contemporary Hindi cinema and in pre-production. So if I don't have these idea and I have no preconceived coding in my mind, then it's basically the other kind of coding. It's called the inductive coding. Coding is basically assigning labels, so for example, sometimes you can use even post-its for coding. Right? So if you use your post-its, we do use post-its for labeling. So you have a large amount of data and you kind of put your post-its against each of your broad understanding, broad meaning. However, I must say here, coding is of course a subjective process. So what codes do you assign, right, will of course depend on your research question, and which of course will depend on you. I mean, somebody else might look at VFX in a completely different context altogether. Somebody might only look at it in terms of production and nothing to do with narrative. So that person's codes and my codes will not be same. It's very subjective process, right? And you have the complete freedom in naming the code. So there is no rule as such as to what codes, how do you name the code. So if you look at the picture here, you can also make paper strips and code and so on and so forth. So this is just to give you an example. In the smallest sense of it, codes are tags or labels which are assigned to meaning. Codes are usually attached to chunks of various size of words, phrases, sentences. Again, to take it a little further, and before you start thinking about codes, which is relevant to any research work or any paper which you have written or you're thinking about and so on and so forth. This is an example of challenges in online education, a small research on that. So what are the challenges in online education? And maybe you have no idea, you have just large chunks of data, you have interviewed a lot of online educators and you're trying to figure out what is the possible impact. So code number one can be some can't afford a good computer, right? So that's number one challenge. So code. So you see that whether this is a pattern which is coming across all interviews, or is it only relevant when one person has only spoken about the challenge. Distraction by family members, institutional challenges, staff shortage, poorly structured curriculum. These are possible problems in online education. So you can start, then assigning these labels to wherever the question of not having good computers come in, right? So and then you see an emergence of some sort of theme the next step, once you have done your coding, that is, you start searching for themes in your research. So say if your larger research area is online education, right, then challenges could be itself a theme, right? Possibilities could be another theme. What is, the pros and the cons and so on and so forth. So how you arrange your themes is up to you. But of course, themes emerge. Once you notice this pattern with the aid of the codes which you have assigned, then you start looking for themes. So if I'm trying to define theme, what is themes? A common recurring pattern across a data set clustered around a central organizing concept. So if the organizing concept is online education, then the themes can be challenges in online education, or the benefits of online education, whether online education is relevant. These could be the possible themes. And of course, within each of these themes, you'll have to identify patterns by figuring out your individual codes. So here is another example. If you look at the screen of the possible codes, and then the codes being thought about in terms of themes. So the codes, and you rearrange your codes and you look for emerging patterns. You look for these themes in your codes. We'll also take a small break here because I want you to take a minute and I want you to think about that what could be the possible codes. Say think about 4 codes, right? What could be the 4 possible codes within the purview of whatever research you have pursued last, right? So whatever research question which you have dealt with in your past research, or whether a paper you have written or you're just thinking about, what could be the 4 possible codes? And try and think of this research question, because somewhere I know that we also have to, before all of this comes, identifying a good research question. What are you going to research on when it comes to media, right? Media being a facilitator and media being a representation. So what is it you're going to research on? So that is also a very pertinent question which we have not addressed in these 2 lectures. So also think about that. So what could be one possible research questions which is connected to society and media? And then what could be the possible 3 or 4 codes which you can think about? I'm sure you all came up with very interesting research questions. Let me explore in this last part of the lecture one more research question for you. Of course, since I come from a background of films, in the sense that I particularly research on cinema, all my examples are related to films. But of course, try and explore print media, try and explore television content, try and explore internet with regard to the possible ideas of research. So another paper which I was recently working on was I was looking at Yash Raj films, right? And I was looking at how Yash Raj films survived during the pandemic times. That is, during the pandemic time, when of course all the year was shut down, all of the multiplexes were shut down. How did this, conglomerate, that is so-called production house conglomerate, survived, right? What were its possible income resources and so on. And of course, again, I resorted to interviews because there's very limited data in terms of figures and numbers which are available to the public disposal. So I had to resort to interviews and look for the possible answers, right? And I tried located at these possible answers, in the sense I defined my codes in terms of say my codes can be merchandising, right, or royalty. So these can be the individual codes, and I tried to find out the possible conclusion, possible ideas, possible themes then, and then come to draw to conclusion as to how exactly Yash Raj exactly survived in this pandemic scenario. So I'm not talking about my conclusion at length here. Of course, the paper will be available in some time, but possible, the idea of telling you this was a possible research question. But I'm sure you all must have also thought about fantastic research questions. Now, once you have your themes in your place, right? So in this examples, once I have kind of more or less a broad idea of where exactly the revenue was being made or how exactly the business structure was formulated, then of course you'll have to go back to this understanding. And this is on a very, very subjective level. You'll have to go back to the understanding. And there is where you think about that, does the data support the theme? right? So you must have taken a lot of interviews, but does this, all of this thing is making sense? Is it answering at all your initial research questions? Sometimes it just doesn't answer the initial research question also, or it's a possibility that it doesn't validate your research question. In that case, you'll have to think about the research question also once again, right? Was it even a valid research question at all? Or say, suppose in the previous case, of course, I had to think about whether pre-production at all played any role in terms of the narratives, or was it just my thought process, or what was it, just a understanding? So this is after you have done the coding, after you have seen any sort of pattern, themes, you will have to revisit your research question and see if all of these understanding is kind of aligned to your initial hypothesis. What is a hypothesis? Hypothesis is the possible answer to the research question. I said possible because that's what you formulate, and then you do your research to figure out or to find out whether whatever hypothesis you have had initially in your mind. I say that yes, VFX leads to more and more horror films. If this is my hypothesis, then I kind of look into the data to find the themes and the patterns, which are whatever I have noticed is in accordance to my hypothesis, or my hypothesis was absolutely wrong. So this is the step where you go back to that, reviewing your themes. Am I trying to fit too much into a theme? Am I trying to say a lot of things, right? You cannot say a lot of things in your research. If the themes overlap, are they really separate themes? Are there themes within themes? Are there sub-themes which you should take note of? Are there other themes within the data? All of this needs to be taken once more into account. This is where basically you define your themes. After all of that, you have concrete themes, concrete patterns which you have noticed in your data. And finally, and the last step, of course, the very important steps, particularly in social science, that is, you create your report. I call it report, you call it write-up, whatever you call it. But the final step of writing all of this systematically, what is referred as academic writing. So sometimes we kind of are good at research, but you also need to have that knack of academic writing. Of course, when my students ask, I say that it always comes with practice. The more you write, the more you are going to get acquainted with. Also, the more you read research articles, the more you will be acquainted with academic writing. So we'll talk about it sometimes in some other lecture, but academic writing is also very important when it comes to research, be it media analysis, media content analysis, or research which is pertaining to media, or in generally in any research. So quickly to take you through the steps once again. Number 1, familiarizing with the data. Number 2, generating initial codes. Number 3, organization of these codes. Then you have searching for themes. You have to then review themes. And finally, you will have to be defining and naming the themes, and writing the report. On that note, we will finish this lecture, and I'm sure after this you will be pursuing a lot of content analysis or thematic analysis, whichever is kind of relevant to you, but in relevance to your research query. Thank you.